Hey everyone, Juan here. Welcome to SQL Lingua Franca, the podcast about analytics that reveals what the documentation does not cover.
SQL Lingua Franca. Mayo.
Today we have a very interesting guest. We have Fanny here in the studio. She's one of the co-authors of Fundamentals of Analytics Engineering, and she's going to give us a deep dive in transforming data. So Fanny, before we even get started in your data and your job and your background, I really want to know you as a person. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. So my name is Fanny, and since we just started talking, maybe my accent hasn't given it away yet, but I'm French. I've been living in Amsterdam for now, I think 6-7 years. Just moved into my new home, so really exciting times for me. And I'm a very creative person, or so I like to think. Painting, pottery, dancing. I also love stand-up comedy, just like you.
Yes.
Yeah, and I love also, I have to say, my Xebia colleagues as well. That's a big part of my life.
Oh, that's good to hear. And before we even introduce the topic, because today we have a deep dive, like I mentioned, tell us about your current role. Tell us about your Xebia colleagues that you love so much.
So I'm an analytics engineer, and for Xebia data. I'm also a principal consultant, so I also take care of the team, make sure that we have what we need together with two other colleagues in the team. And as an analytics engineer, I mostly focus on the transformation part. So I think about how we're going to move data from point A to B in a scalable manner. So that's me in a nutshell.
Okay. Let's pretend that all of the stars have aligned. What would be in your consultancy role right now, like your ideal consultancy gig?
I love when there's transformation. And when I say transformation, I also mean change. Meaning, I love it when it's not just about transforming data, but it's also about upskilling people to new tools and practices. Because introducing new technology usually comes with bringing people on board into using it and adopting it in the right way. So that is my favorite kind of thing. And usually that even involves hiring, thinking about the team structure. So I really like it when there's a combination of technical topics and less technical, or at least more organizational or people topics.
Yeah, properly like the cultural side.
Yeah.
I guess that's what people refer to when they say making a big impact.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, I think there's a lot of impact to have through people. And I think that's also why in my career, I decided at some point, I think you always have this choice, right? Do I want to hyper specialize, or do you want to be more maybe on the people side? Like, what do I want to do? Do I want to lift people, or do I want to know this particular technology? Some brilliant people can do both. I decided to pick one and still like be able to have my consultancy gig and still do the stuff I love on the engineering side.
That's good. Today we have a deep dive. Would you like to introduce the topic, Fanny?
Yeah, so like I said, I've been moving houses, didn't have a lot of time to think and prepare for this episode, but this weekend as I was putting up IKEA furniture and thinking about today, I thought, you know what, let's just talk about something that I know of, which is a chapter that I wrote for a book that we just published around transformations. So how do we transform data, since it's the thing that I do most. And as I was also working with IKEA furniture at the moment, I thought, wow, actually, the best transformation pipelines are those that are engineered like IKEA furniture. And I thought, well, that's an original idea to bring to Juan's podcast.
Okay, I'm excited. I
Yeah.
can already imagine where this is going. Let's start by the basics. What exactly do you mean by transforming data? Even though that should sound like familiar to most people listening.
So what I mean by transforming data is you have raw data that you've just maybe ingested, and you have a use case. To enable that use case, you need to shape the data. You need to transform it, as in maybe you need to introduce some business logic. Maybe you need to clean it, harmonize it, maybe change data types. So it's very vague, very broad, because there's a lot that can happen during transformation. And the whole point of transforming it well is to know where to do what kind of transformation in your pipelines.
Okay, understood. So we're talking about every type of manipulation.
Yeah, correct.
So tell us, what are some of your hot takes when it comes to manipulating data?
So I think that the simpler, the better. Sometimes, especially in the data world, we like to create some sort of barrier to entry. We think that the more complex, the coolest it is. I don't think so. I think that if you're a data professional and no one knows what you're doing, no one can read your code because it's so complex, maybe you're not doing a good job. So that's where, again, the IKEA furniture comes in. It's like, can you make it accessible for everyone? At Xebia Data, we're very passionate in general about data democratization, especially the analytics engineering in the team. We even have a white paper about it, and I firmly believe in it. I think data is something that should be usable, accessible, available to, if not everyone, most people in the company. And simplicity is key in it.
Okay, so when everybody writes code, I think we're all working towards a certain constraint or goal. Sometimes it's like really like how long it takes to run. Sometimes it's like testing or whatever it is. What you're claiming is that for transformations, you fully advocate that readability and understanding the code is the most important criteria.
Yeah, I would say it's the first one. So I agree
Okay.
that optimization is important, but I would say it comes second. Because try to optimize a query when it's a big spaghetti bowl or like a huge query and you have to, select parts of it and just try and run them separately. That is so much more difficult than when it's already done properly. It's already easy to read. You already know what's doing what. And now you're thinking, okay, now I see that this part could be optimized. And maybe you want to have some clustering or partitioning in there. But first of all, that is a problem that might come indeed, but that where mainly most of the time the solution is actually going to be into adopting good practices in your transformations. And second, it will be a lot easier if it's already good written code.
Indeed. I personally love regular expressions, and I can see some beauty in complexity. But I think we can all agree, also the people listening, that in the current data landscape, probably the biggest threshold, the biggest bottleneck is the amount of people out there. We have a lot of people are just getting started, a lot of people getting up to speed in the data world, and every single thing we can do for them, it really pays off. I think if there were way too many senior data people in the world, maybe understandability would play a different role. But I guess in this data landscape, I have to fully agree with you.
Yeah, and if you think in terms of making your pipeline scalable, right, you want to have as many people as possible able to use them. So if you have this one very smart person who wrote all of it, but is the only one who can understand it, you're now completely dependent on this person. If they go on holiday, you cannot do anything about the pipeline. And that is something that is actually very common.
It's painfully common, yes.
It is painfully common. And I've been in that position where I was that person and I thought, oh, wow, I must be very special then. And then I learned that actually I wasn't. I was just writing poor code that no one could pick up. So, yeah, it is, I think, if you take the IKEA furniture, it is a piece of furniture that you're assembling, and it is the last and most crucial step of it, right? Because it's what's going to make it usable. And no matter your skill set, basically, and no matter the tools you own at home, you can put it up because the instructions are so clear, because the engineers have thought through about the smallest but reusable components to make that furniture. so that you can actually do it. And I think that is beautiful. I think if I can achieve that in my transformation pipelines, then I will be happy.
Yes, but like you mentioned, it requires people to think, have empathy, document, simplify processes. I really think that being replaceable, like for your own data team, for whatever type of data job that you do, it's ironically very, very difficult.
Hmm.
It is like you mentioned because of you writing terrible code, or maybe because there are literally no other people to take over. It's very easy to be in that position where you're irreplaceable. And then that sounds nice in terms of job security, but that's also not an amazing strategy in the long term.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, not to be now doing a lot of too much advertising for Xebia, but I do think it is like a differentiating factor for us as consultants. Um, we have, whenever we start a new project, we also have a mission to make ourselves obsolete. So to make sure that the client can pick up our work, and that means either through upskilling people while we're there or hiring new people. And we always make sure that that moment comes. And then maybe the client needs something else. Maybe we stay longer after that because there is still some need, but we don't try to stay just to stay, or we absolutely don't try to make ourselves irreplaceable. On the contrary, we try to, as early as possible, define a strategy so that the client can be autonomous.
For sure. And it might be a little bit more difficult for the sales team, but in reality, it's much nicer for the consultants. Like, we're happy, we see different environments, we learn. And for the clients, like, they're not vendor locked. So I can definitely see a lot of value in that. And
Yeah.
I really like that approach.
Yeah, absolutely. It's more future proof as well.
Yeah.
It works better for everyone. It's a win win.
Okay. So far, we have talked a lot about readability,
Hmm.
but I think I've also heard a glimpse of other things like modularity. Would you like to
Yeah.
explain the next principle?
Yeah, so modularity is, and I've mentioned this, about having the smallest reusable components. So think of user defined functions,
Yeah.
think of common table expressions, think of anything that allows you to break down the complexity of your code in parts that you can reuse. So if my company is going to be converting regularly from dollars to euros, then I better write a user defined function or have maybe a table of the conversion rates. And this piece of the work should be reusable across my pipelines. Um, it could also mean layering your code. So if you're familiar with DBT and Databricks, you've heard terms like the medallion architecture, or having row and then staging and then intermediate and marts
Yes.
models. So this is now a very common and accepted method to make sure that you reuse parts of your transformations, and that the most reusable parts are very early in the logic. So maybe something that is purely business logic, very specific to a use case, you're going to keep at the very end of your pipelines and move logic that is going to be reused by a lot of stakeholders upstream in your pipelines. So that is another part, which is not exactly actually modularity, I realize, more about layers.
Yeah.
And modularity can be done within queries or outside queries. So within queries, yeah, again, CTEs, UDFs, outside
DBT macros, Python
DBT
functions.
macros, Python functions, and actually talking about DBT as well, the ref function is a very good example of being able to reference another model. So you literally reuse the model, and it even allows you to create this directed acrylic graph where you can see very clearly like the lineage of your transformations. And if you did it well, it should look very layered, and you should be able to see
Yeah.
every step of the pipeline.
And you also mentioned reusability, but I would argue that there are a lot more benefits of working modularly. The first one would be it's much easier to test every individual module, macro, function, whatever you want to call it. It's much easier to test if you make them really small.
Mm-hmm.
And second is encapsulation. I know this is a hot take, but for example, when I work in DBT, If something has more than 3 lines of code, I immediately create a macro,
Yeah.
even if I only use it once, just because having my macro somewhere else is going to make the main script much, much easier to read. And then I just don't have to fish for that logic anywhere.
Yeah, I agree. Everything should have a single purpose. So there's also a principle that's called, I think, single responsibility purpose, or the other way around. That basically says one thing does just one thing, and you cannot have suddenly I don't know, a macro that does two things at the same time. Then just break it down, create a second one, because then you can maybe reuse that first part or debug it more easily than if you put it all together and it's all mixed up.
However, I have to say it's also easier said than done, because if you think about it, I found myself in the situation where I create way too many functions. And then also, when you have something like SQL, very specifically SQL, you don't always have a input on how things are done. So there are some languages that are 100% declarative, like first go here, then do this, then and do it this way. Some languages that are the opposite, like do this and I don't care how you do it. SQL is a weird mix in between.
Yeah. So it's true that as a team, you often have to also think about how we're going to write code. And that's where also tools like DBT that allow you to peer review the code because it's all Git versioned. It allows you to have another pair of eyes that maybe comes in and says, hey, this works, but I would suggest doing it this way. And then maybe if those conversations occur a couple of times, maybe during your sprint retrospective, you can have a talk and say, hey, actually, I noticed that we regularly see this in the code, and this is my take on it. And maybe there needs to be a discussion around it. I've had clients where we decided at some point, after developing for some time together, to kind of take a break and see, okay, what are the habits that we all have?
Yeah.
And what do we like, what do we don't like? And we have to make a collective decision because we all have to use this code. So it's not just about me in my bedroom writing my piece of code. It's about me writing it for other people that are going to also use it. And I think being very critical, taking a very critical look at the code you write, just like when you write a book, you have to do some proofreading, proof editing, and you and I know how painful that is. Actually, when you write a book, editing is as much, if not more, effort than writing in the first place. And I believe it should be the same with code. Maybe you do a first, drop of what you think how you think you should be doing it, and then maybe you review it and think differently. And then with experience, it becomes easier to just get it right from the start. But I personally still sometimes don't know how I'm going to do something until I jot it down, and then that's where I improve it.
Yes, and there is also something that I would like to mention about my experience, and that is when the code is properly modularized and everything is broken down into small components, it is so much easier to give feedback on it, because then you can test every single function, call it somewhere else. When you get some of those scripts that it's like everything runs or everything fails, it's very hard to give some really good feedback, because you know that every little change, and you change 3 lines here and then everything breaks and you're like, I shouldn't have bothered.
Yeah.
So yeah, I agree with you. It really helps when people are checking the code and giving suggestions.
Yeah, I agree. I've also been in that situation where I get a pull request and I look at it and I'm like, oh, I don't really feel like reviewing this amount of code right now. And it's too big. And you think, well, to test this and now to know whether it does what I think it does will take forever. And you're very much tempted to be like, you know what, I trust you. But that's just not a good strategy eventually.
Like a colleague used to say, I know exactly everything that is wrong with your script, but it will take me an eternity to write something better.
I like that.
Yes. Okay, so moving on. You said modularity. What else? What are some interesting topics to discuss here?
Yeah, so we talked about indeed modularity, readability. We talked about layers. I think another topic that is important is documentation. So again, going back to the IKEA furniture, and I know people hate it, but honestly, if you think about IKEA furniture documentation or like the instructions, it's fascinating. It's fascinating because you have to pay attention to the details because they tell you exactly, very precisely how you're supposed to do things. And if you overlook the tiniest element, the tiniest drawing, you're gonna mess it up. So as I was also assembling furniture, I thought this is quite amazing actually, that they did this without words, and they explain very extensively the how you do it. The difference with documenting a pipeline is that you should not be documenting the how. The how should be in the code. The code should be self-explanatory, but you should be documenting the why. You should explain why you're doing this here, especially if you've made a decision that doesn't seem very clear. Why did you comment out the not no test? Like, well, what's happening there? Just add a comment, say why.
Yes.
Um, on the other end, of course, you have DBT talks, for instance. So you have, or catalogs. You have many ways now to increase the discoverability of your data and explain what is what. So that's another part of the work, I would say, because that's more about how you're going to be able to let your stakeholders adopt your data product. But when it comes to the code itself, the transformation pipeline itself, documenting the why is very important.
Yes, I sometimes see in code like a filter clause on like product is equal to 3,000. Product ID is equal to 3,000 something. I really expect them to tell me, oh yeah, this product ID is actually this, and the reason we're filtering it out or keeping it in for is because of this, this, and this. But if you're analyzing this other thing, please erase this.
Yeah,
Something
absolutely.
like that makes a massive difference.
I agree. I've seen so many times a case when statement or a where clause where it says in the comment exactly filtering this out. And you think, yeah, I know that's exactly what the code does. That's exactly what the where clause says.
Yes.
But why? Why are we filtering it out? Because especially with a filter, you might think that reduces the reusability of your query, right? Because now you filtered out some of it and you want to do that as late as possible. So why are you doing it here? And sometimes it's going to be very clear. You're going to be, let's say, where valid to is null. And then you think, okay, they are filtering out anything that is that has a valid date. That has expired. So the valid to has an expiration date. But there are many cases, especially when you have a code, product ID or something like that, you wouldn't know. And I think ideally it would even refer you to maybe the document, whether it's a PowerPoint or a SharePoint document or whatever, that says exactly what is what.
Yes. So you touched already two topics there. The first one is going back to layering. I fully believe that maybe 99 to 95% of all of the renamings should happen exactly in the same stage in the same file. Same for anything that you would consider data cleaning. Same for everything that you would consider as loading or unioning or joining and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, just even though it's hard, keeping everything consistent to the same layer makes a massive difference.
Yeah.
But then going to the topic of documentation that you mentioned, we already talked like, yes, the whole, every time when I see a Python script that has a comment that says loading data, I know that's a very beginner mistake. You really should focus on the why. Maybe what are some other tips that you would have for people that want to work on documentation?
That's a good question.
Well,
Because because the thing with documentation is do it as early as possible when you decide, okay, let's do it, or when you start developing new pipelines, or maybe you have a new platform, do it as early as possible, because it's very difficult to do after the fact. You don't remember what you did exactly. You have to look back at what's what, and it's painful, it's cumbersome. I don't like when I have to spend days documenting, so I try to do it as I go. But yeah, that's maybe like a very basic tip, but in my opinion, a useful one.
You know, some developers say like you should write the documentation and the test before you start writing any other line of code. I honestly have never met any person that does this well. But yeah, I agree. Doing it a bit earlier tends to pay off.
In a way, I would agree with this, and I think
Yeah.
maybe you wouldn't. Maybe you're not writing it down in your code already, but ideally, for instance, the definitions of your data fields, they should come from the business because they are the data owners. They are the ones who are asking for this particular field. So since they give this to you upfront, and maybe they even indicate what data type that should be, and maybe what constraints should be applied, whether that should be a unique primary key, that should be there should not be any nulls. Maybe the accepted values are like there's a list provided by them. Then you already have that kind of documentation before you even start writing the code. Of course, whether you should already add the comments in the code before you even write it, I think that's a bit extreme. But yeah, maybe that helps as well to kind of break down your work and avoid redoing it over and over again.
Yeah, honestly, one thing that I've seen in some companies that I think works extremely well is asking whoever is requesting the data to write the documentation.
Yeah.
And of course, to make that work, you really need some templates and you really need that the person requesting has to be a bit technical. But indeed, people already share a lot of those details. For example, when you calculate this, make sure to exclude this value and this value, or make sure that you use the data coming from here and so on.
Yeah. Have you, so I think indeed it might be a little bit of a burden, you could say, on whoever requested the data in the first place. But going back to IKEA, it seems like this is my passion now.
Yes.
There's something called the IKEA effect.
Oh, okay.
So in 2011, they did a study and they saw that subjects that assembled the furniture themselves were willing to pay 63% more for the same furniture. So we value things where we have input into more than things that are just given to us. And I definitely recognize that in the data world as well, because I was a data analyst. I was providing a lot of data to people, and I don't think it was always appreciated at its actual value for the effort that was demanded. I think if they had some input in it and taken part in it more actively, they would have valued it a bit more, because then suddenly it's something that they contributed to that now comes to life. And especially if they are contributing to the later stages of the transformation, even more so if, let's say, they have an analytics engineer that builds the transformations and then they pick it up and build a dashboard on top, then it has a complete different type of value to them. And I think it's the same with documentation.
No, for sure. I've seen companies that they're very strict. Like, you have to write a ticket, you need to do this, and they create a lot of process just because they know that the people that actually follow the process and that bother, they probably really need it.
Yeah.
Now, it's not a perfect system because you can always say, like, I'm not going to follow this. I'm going to create my own shadow IT. And that's how you create, like, platforms on top of platforms. But there is some truth in making people not work, but put some of the effort if they want something in return from the data team.
Yeah. Yeah, and own it, right?
Yes.
Own it fully. That's also something that any data professional has faced, is sometimes you're being asked to deliver something, but the something that you're being asked is not very clear. And
Always.
If you have a very good product owner, they will think about this. Of course, they will refine and help you like figure out exactly what is needed. But it's not always the case. We don't always have teams that are big enough or the resources to have a product owner to help. Yeah. And getting to the business or whoever is requesting this data to be very specific about what they need is very difficult. And that is also understandable, of course, because sometimes it's very difficult for someone who doesn't have experience with this particular data for that particular company. Maybe they just joined and the company never had that data available to them. So for them to express a very clear need is difficult because they haven't explored it even. But then maybe that is what they need right now. What they need right now is some sort of self-service or way to explore the data rather than a very constrained dashboard or report.
No, I fully agree. Sometimes, but it's a tricky proposition because when people know very clearly what they want, how to get it, where to get it, generally it's much more efficient for them to get it. So if you work as a data person and you handle any type of ad hoc request, just know the people that have very clear requests, chances are they're familiar with data and they're getting them themselves.
Yeah.
We are like, I guess, cursed to always work with requests that are not very clear.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's what makes it interesting, right? Personally, I love thinking about, okay, what is the
Structuring.
actual problem here behind? Talking to someone and trying to figure out what they actually need. Um, if you're getting very clear but frequent ad hoc requests, I think that's also a red flag. That this could be made available somewhere different than you literally just translating a sentence into a SQL query. In that case, there are tools that may help you with that, especially nowadays with LLMs. But it could also be as simple as a dashboard that just gives that information, especially if it's coming frequently.
Yeah, a dashboard with some filter sometimes does the job.
Absolutely, and that's maybe also another one of my hot takes. I
Go
think
for it.
I think in recent years we've been, I mean, for a while now, I think we've been bashing a little bit dashboards and think that maybe sounds simple if you compare them to the realm of AI. But the reality of it is that these are very valuable and powerful tools, and very commonly needed, yet a lot of companies don't have them. And I've also noticed that a lot of clients, they are very humbled by the fact that they're only asking for a dashboard here and they're almost apologizing for it because they think that the rest of the industry is building rockets. And that is
Yes.
just not the reality of it. The reality is that dashboards are very valuable on their own. I don't think they're going to disappear tomorrow. And often you need them, you need that information, you need that level of adoption of data and
Yep.
understanding of data before you would even think of doing something more, because they allow you to explain your data um, in a way that is very accessible to a lot of people.
I agree. Some people say that dashboards are useless, but as somebody that built hundreds of dashboards in his career, I think the problem is very, very few people, or it doesn't come natural to people building properly actionable dashboards.
Yeah.
And it's hard. Like, I'm very conscious that that's the main goal of a dashboard, and it's still sometimes difficult.
Yeah, I agree. If you think that dashboards are not good, maybe the dashboards you have right now are not good. Maybe you need to think about redoing them. Maybe there's some feedback to be taken there. But dashboards in general can be extremely versatile,
Yeah.
actually. And I was just like earlier, like I said LLMs, and then I thought, well, you know what? Actually, I think most cases a dashboard will do that for you. If you also make your dashboard very user friendly, if you have filters, if you have input parameters, you can do a lot of things
Yeah.
in dashboards.
Yes, indeed. I want to take a tangent, and that is, if I have to be honest, I really don't like IKEA documentation. Well, to be honest, I'm terrible at building things that don't involve a keyword. But when I see them, I think I never get them. I only started getting IKEA furniture when I started looking for the videos of people building them. And that is something that I kind of want to inject here. And that is, to me, if you record your screen and walk people through the process, that makes documentation much, much better. And it depends. But to me, just recording my screen takes much, much less effort. And it captures a lot of the details that people might not know, like in which screen should I be and what should I see in the terminal before I type this and all of those things. So maybe Funny, do you have other creative ways of enhancing your documentation?
I really like the idea of recording. I've done that in the past. And I do think it really helps. Although different people have different ways to discover data. Um, Personally, I'm much more of the kind of person that's gonna Google stuff, use a search function in Confluence. So, and I might not have the patience of going through the entire video, but especially when you have to set something up, like the starter instructions, I always feel indeed like a video is really good for that because you can really follow the steps sequentially and make sure that you see everything and that you're seeing the same as what you're supposed to see. I did think that IKEA instructions were sometimes particularly difficult, although after getting some experience with it, I realized actually that I had to be religious about following the steps. And sometimes I was getting a little bit too creative and impatient with it. And that's where it went wrong. But as soon as I started being like, okay, what does this mean? And sometimes I would have to even look a bit further to understand what that sign that was saying, do not do this, meant. Because I was like, what does it mean, do not do this? And what do they mean exactly? And what's wrong with it? So, of course, it's very sparse and precise. But I do think that when writing your own documentation, you can also add a lot of screenshots. You can also add a lot of pictures everywhere. And however, there's always this thing where it will become obsolete as well, right? Because the tools, maybe the UI is going to change. So what do you do then? Do you just rewrite the documentation? And now we're talking, I think, about something different.
Keeping it up to date.
Yeah, because we're talking about keeping it up to date. And also we're talking about using a tool. Let's say you're upskilling someone to use DBT and maybe you're going to write documentation to help people get onboarded on the platform. But when it comes to the code itself, I mean, SQL doesn't change, so you are safe to just write whatever you have to write. If the purpose of your code changes, then that's where indeed you need to keep it up to date.
Yes, indeed. I think another principle, I don't know if you're planning to talk about this, but I think it's nice to introduce it, is encapsulation. Sometimes I remember very clearly, you just reminded me of a client that I used to work with. Their people used to have a lot of trouble writing Python code to load data from a database. You know, everybody that has worked with SQL Alchemy knows the con.open, .close, and all of those methods that are a bit maybe hard to know by heart. What they did is they built a Python package that already had all of that with the credentials of the database and the right permissions and so on. And it was just as simple as loading the package and then boom, it was there.
Yeah. I think that's also something that is made very much easier in DBT because you can cross-reference projects. So you can literally import another project as a package. And then you can reuse models, you can reuse macros. So you can either define dependencies between projects or you can even like import them literally as a package. And I find that really useful. Especially for macros that will be common across your projects, especially if you're thinking about a hub and spoke model type of organization where you have a central data team that maybe has the big picture in mind and will build a lot of the first layers of transformation and spokes that will be reusing a lot of that. Then you can think of cross-referencing projects also for collaboration among the spoke teams.
Yes. To me, the biggest value added from DBT is that before either it was impossible or very cumbersome to do what you just mentioned, like bring a package.
Yeah.
Like if you ever did SQL work before DBT, you would just have to Google, like, how do I calculate this? While here, you can just simply import a package like DBT dates, and then you don't have to worry about like how to calculate the first day of the month.
Yeah.
Type of thing.
Absolutely. And I mean, it won't come as a surprise because as an analytics engineer, I love DBT. But yeah, I do think that they're really good at making things simpler, which is by now, I think you've understood the thing I like.
Yes.
And to know also that most likely if you're trying to do something right now that seems a little bit complex, someone also has tried to do it.
Yeah.
So there's no need to reinvent the wheel. There's probably somewhere a package that allows you to do that. And I think especially for engineers, sometimes it's tempting, right, to build things on your own from scratch. I also find it interesting. I mean, you try to untangle a lot of problems, and it might be very elegant. But at the end of the day, if there's a good tool that allows you to do it, I do think that it's always best to use that. It's less
Agree.
technical depth. Maybe there's some dependency, and it has to be a good tool, of course. And you don't want to just have huge tool proliferation in your company. But it's just more appropriate most of the time because the people who are
Agree.
building it are specialized in it.
That's interesting. Do you have maybe any other principles? We have already mentioned quite a lot. So I don't know if you still have anything in the list.
I mean, I must have maybe on Friday during lunch, you'll hear some other ones. But
Okay.
nothing on the top of my mind. Um,
Okay, then maybe let's go to the next topic that I wanted to talk about. And that is like data transformations, I think, are the thing that every single data job does.
mhm.
I don't care if you're like handling infrastructure, chances are you still have to clean some stuff here and there. Maybe what are some things that the average person or a beginner tends to get wrong quite often when it comes to data transformations?
One thing that it's going to be very simple, but when you name what you're doing, let's say you have a CTE, often we come up with these obscure names. And sometimes I review code and I'm like, what does it mean? And then if you read the code, you understand, oh, it's doing this. And then just name it for what it is. Just say what it is. So again, make it as simple as possible. It's interesting, and I wonder what the mind does to us um, when we're writing code, because it seems like it should be intuitive, right? It seems like if you're doing this, and just name it exactly for what it is. Same for if you're creating a table, if you're creating a model in DBT, name it exactly for what it is. And yet somehow we find ways to
Yes.
overcomplicate it. And I've noticed that when we're beginners, we tend to do that. And I don't know if it's because we're trying to make it look a bit more important than what it actually is. But that's one of the things that I've noticed.
I think sometimes what I see beginners write a function called like transforming data. And then inside of that function is every single thing that you're going to apply there.
Yeah.
But as somebody that has been working with data for quite a while, I sometimes fall into the opposite, which is I build a function, let's say something like remove the employees from the clients, right? That's the name of the function. That's exactly what it does. And then when I start writing it, I realize like, ooh, this is not generic enough. Of this one could be more reusable. So you end up with something super abstract, like filtering people from people type of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see what you mean, and that might be the reason why I sometimes see this. And of course, right now I'm expressing an opinion or a criticism on something that, I mean, it's a lot easier to review someone's code than to write it in the first place, of course.
Yes.
It's hard to review code, but I mean that it's easier to criticize in a sense, and feedback should not be meant to criticize. But yeah, I agree that as you do it, and I have this as well, I'm sometimes unsure about what I'm gonna name something because I end up adding to it, and then it's not what it was in the first place. So maybe you think of it at the end, and at the end you just relook at it and you're like, oh, actually, I should refactor my code. And I personally do that a lot. After I've written something, I just refactor, and maybe I refactor a couple of times before I'm happy with it.
Yeah. Okay. The next topic I wanted to bring up is, do you have some tips for the listeners?
I think that I want to say, okay, and I'm afraid to repeat myself now, which is do
Okay.
not repeat yourself. You're not supposed to. In
Oh,
code.
dry principles. Yes.
Exactly. But yeah, I would say dry indeed. Single purpose for your code. Make it modular. Make it reusable. Layer it. Easy to read. Comment the why, not the how. I'm probably forgetting a lot of things there.
Maybe more than how to do it. Are there any nice resources or nice things that people can do to practice or
To get better at it.
yeah?
Um, that's an interesting question because most of this, personally, I've learned because I would try to do something, and then you're on Stack Overflow, and then you see comments, and people comment on what someone else did on their query. And then you think, oh, and then say, yeah, you should write this way because then this way this is more usable, this is more readable, and you see a lot of that feedback when you look at these threads. So I think that's how I learned most. Actually, it's struggling and then trying to solve things and then reading these threads, but not stopping necessarily at the first answer or the one with most votes, but looking at all those where sometimes there's a bit of a debate, and I love that because then you get like different opinions about something and you get the different perspectives on how it should be done. And it rarely is all perspectives are valid usually. It's just that they have some subtleties to them that you think, this will be useful in this scenario and this in this scenario.
I have something funny when it comes to data transformations, and that is, I think it should be possible to learn a lot of this from like a course or some scenarios that are pre-built by somebody else. But the truth is that the most I've learned from transforming data is when I get a request, and it's often the ones that sound like super obvious. For example, one time I got a table with a log of people like entering and exiting a building, and they were like, can you give me a table that tells me how many people were there in the building at a certain moment? And you're like, yeah, of course. Then you start typing like, oh, no, it's not that easy.
Yeah.
Or you get a log of like different people calling each other. And they're like, can you give me a list of the people that haven't called each other? It's like, sure. But like those situations that sound very obvious, but in reality, they make you think about the problem. I'm just often thinking like it's a shame that they're kind of difficult to replicate. Like,
yeah, I agree. I guess it's because the cases that you will see in school or in any e-learning platform, they've already been, although like they are getting really good, but often they've already thought about it. And indeed, in real life, you're gonna get data that is structured in a way that is not usable, because usually it is data that is matching the source system, whatever it is. So if they are logging like people coming in and out, and maybe there's a sensor on the door, whatever, the way the data is going to be structured as it is sent from that system is not going to match any of the analytics use case that you're going to put on top. And that tension is exactly where the transformation has to happen. And I've definitely had this before where someone will ask, oh, what do you think? We have this kind of data and we need to do this with that. Is that difficult? I'm like, no, this is very easy. It sounds like an aggregation, But then you get the data and you're like, oh, okay, yeah, no, actually it's not that simple. It needs to be transformed quite heavily and you're going to have a lot of data quality issues with it. But you don't know until you've done this sort of feasibility assessment by looking at the data itself. But I personally still am this overly optimistic person that says, oh, yeah, sure, this is easy. And then I definitely sell myself into trouble because now I've said it's easy and people expect they're just going to have this tomorrow.
Oh, I'm fairly sure we have all done that at a certain point in our careers. Well, Fanny, I think we could speak about this topic much, much longer. And it's funny because you think about data transformations. There are hundreds of things we didn't cover that I know are interesting, and I'm just not surprised. Like, wow, yeah, it's a very interesting topic. Would you like to have some closing remarks for this episode?
I would just encourage everyone to maybe value transformations for what they are. I don't know, like it sounds to me like transformations are a little bit, they're squeezed in between. It's like you have data engineering and it's like a big field, and you have data analytics and data science, and they come at the end. And in between, you do have a lot of transformations that happen. And it may sound very down to earth, but I think it's like the essence of what we have to do with data. It's the step that allows you to then create value on top, literally. And yeah, I would just say pay attention to it. Don't minimize or dismiss the importance of it, because it is in fact quite key. And I think it's something that we witness a lot is companies will invest a lot in maybe the technology for the platform. They will invest a lot in maybe data science or advanced data analytics. But the part in between, transforming the data, just like we just described, sometimes it just sounds very easy on the surface.
Yes.
But actually, if you think, let's engineer this in a very wise manner. Let's make it very scalable, easy to use. Let's make it such that it really enhances data democratization. Then it has a whole different skill and value for the company.
Yes. So thank you, Fanny. That was an amazing episode. It was a pleasure to have you here.
Likewise.
For those of you that want to talk to you, catch up with you, hear more about this topic, where can they find you?
So you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm there. And I think that's mainly it. Actually, I think probably my profile is on the Xebia page as well. But yeah, I'm always open to talking if anyone wants to have a chat.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Fanny.